So last week we were talking about the term epistemology, how it is that we know what we know as humans. And there are a variety of ways in which we gather and assess and create knowledge. One of those that we talked about last week is science, using the scientific method. This week we'll be talking about other ways of gathering and assessing and creating knowledge. But the scientific method, as we talked about last time, is a very carefully crafted process by which we observe things in the natural environment around us. Based on those observations, we propose a hypothesis about how things work, explanations of the observations that we make of the world around us. Then we create carefully controlled tests to verify whether or not those hypotheses that we come up with to explain the observations are accurate or inaccurate. So an up or down on a hypothesis. We then can use a hypothesis to generate broader theories of what is true in the world. And as we have talked about all semester as critical thinkers, what's key is that once we establish some sense of what is true, we always keep the door open, even in the scientific method, for new information and for new testing that would help us remake, reconfigure what we think we already know. So that the scientific method, like other forms of knowledge, is essentially always generating new leads and asking for new tests of truth. It never completely closes the door on the possibility that something needs to be added to what has been established as fact and true and as explanation. We also talked a little bit about the fact that just because scientists are engaged in the scientific method doesn't mean that their own personal biases don't come into play as well. And we encountered lots of scientists who were very famous but had conducted bad science or had misinterpreted their science in ways that made it difficult to see the truth of the matter. So it's important for us to know that science is not perfect and scientists are not perfect. So we have to, as critical thinkers, come up with ways in which we can assess the very science that claims to be based on objective fact. How do we assess science and scientists knowing that they're not always correct, even though they may present themselves as being correct? The way that we do that is by, first of all, asking what are the qualifications of that scientist? Do they have, in fact, the expertise that they need to be doing the kind of study that they're doing? Has the study been peer-reviewed? Have other experts in the field given a stamp of approval on that work? Has it been replicated? So has that same scientific study or the same finding been found and repeated by other scientists, so that we're not just relying on one scientist, since we know that all scientists can potentially be biased. If we amalgamate replication across various studies, then the scientists' biases will tend to balance each other out, and we'll tend to get a better, more objective approach to the question at hand. So again, are the scientists, in fact, experts in the exact field? Has their study been peer-reviewed? Has it been replicated by other scientists, and have other scientists found the same thing or not? What does a meta-analysis, as we learned about in this chapter, a meta-analysis of those facts tell us? So if we compare a whole variety of studies on that topic together, what consensus comes out of it? Is there a wider consensus among experts in that field? And then finally, has this finding withstood the test of time? That's to say that despite having been around for many, many years, no one has been able to disprove it yet. So those are the facts that you can be quite certain of. Things like the fact of evolution, or things like the fact of climate change. These are well established, replicated by thousands and thousands of scientists and scientific studies, and have withstood the test of time for many decades, both of these general theories of what's happening in the world. So we need to not accept all science at face value. We need to put it to a test. And these are some of the ways that we can think about the quality of the findings that we are reading or hearing about or taking in before we accept them as fact and as true. The book we've been reading so far has been giving us some really interesting things to think about in relationship to human nature. And what we've learned, and which we'll go into in another slide in a minute, is that humans are very social. We're socially oriented rather than individualistically oriented as a species. It is, in fact, what characterizes us. Our very sociality is what characterizes us as a species. So if that's so true, we're so socially oriented, then why do we do horrible things? What would provoke us to do awful things to each other? And the answers that we have gotten from the Stanford prison experiment, that people who take on roles that give them the green light to be violent will be violent, or that humans who are ordered to be violent by an authority figure will be violent if they're told to do so. None of those have proven to be true. So the Stanford prison experiment is not true. Milgram shock experiment is only partially true. Adolf Eichmann's claim that he did it because he was ordered to, in fact, turns out not to be true, even in his own recounting of his own horrific acts. So then, what can we gather from what we know of human nature that can help us answer this broader question of not just who we are as humans, but why we as humans actually commit atrocities? So what we know already, what we already talked about in some other videos, is that we are socially oriented and that enables us to learn from each other in ways that makes us spread new knowledge faster than other species of apes like us. And so that's actually given us an edge against Neanderthals and other species of Homo. And that social orientation comes along with a bunch of biases that all of us as humans are subject to. So as much as we would like to be entirely above bias, we as humans naturally have built into us certain kinds of biases. So our availability bias, that is, the likelihood that we will trust the stories we've been told and use those stories that we've been told to interpret the world around us, that is a natural human state. It's like the stories that we are told, it comes as like our operating system, and we tend to conform to that operating system that we are raised with. We naturally, as humans, want to hold on to the things that we already believe to be true, and it's difficult for us to allow them to go and let go of them when new information comes in that would negate our beliefs. And negativity bias means that we tend to focus on the things that are dangerous or salacious or sensational or anything that has to do with blood or guts. All of that is going to grab our attention more readily and capture us in a way that then can make us biased to everything else that's happening. So these forms of bias are natural to humans and things that we have to try to learn to overcome if we want to see things more clearly, if we want to actually be able to experience the world more objectively. So this is all information we've had so far already. We're well aware of these facts about ourselves. So then where do we go next with this explanation as to why it is that humans do bad things? And in the last chapter, what we learned is that the very social orientation that makes us humans is in fact also what makes us able to do horrible things to other humans. as long as those other humans are thought of as being outside our social group. So our social orientation makes it such that we can be misled into committing acts of violence on people that we deem to not be part of our social group. And that bias towards an in-group is often called tribalism. So tribalism can be the very basis, our very sociality, our tightness, our orientation towards the group. That can be the same thing that makes us commit acts of violence against people who are in different tribes from us on the opposite side of things. So our tight sociality is also the explanation of our willingness to commit violence, but only if we can be convinced that that violence is for the good of our social group. There are, of course, exceptions to this. There are psychopaths who are willing to commit violence for their own benefit or for their own pleasure. But those kinds of violence are very rare, statistically speaking. The majority of violence that humans come to perpetrate against each other are usually oriented towards what is thought of as the good of the group. And you'll notice in both the Milgram experiment and the Zimbardo experiment from last chapter that people who were involved in that were convinced and coerced into doing things that were harmful by telling them that, in fact, what they were doing was good, or they were contributing to something that was for the greater good. So humans tend to have to think that they are doing good for their group in order to be able to commit violence against other humans. Okay, so we've talked so much about science so far that we now have to bring in another source of information and knowledge that we need to think critically about. So that is, in this chapter, the way in which we come to learn of what's going on in the world through news media. So one thing that's important to pinpoint in our discussion before we get more into the news media is the fact that not all news media operate in the same way. Most of the news media in the United States are operating in a profit-driven model. They're largely corporations that are seeking out profit for their shareholders or for their owners. And that's very different than forms of newsmaking that are funded through the viewers or the listeners, or that are funded through a public grants or general public support. So around the world, there are lots of countries that provide funding for the news media and for television and radio stations in the name of the public good. And this form of public support, public funding for news media means that those news organizations can reflect the news in ways that are free from the need to make a profit. And that then changes the way in which they tend to tell the news. They're not usually attempting to tell the news based on what will grab the most eyeballs, what will be the most sensational, and bring them the most viewers that will then allow them to have the most advertisers and the most advertising dollars. Instead, they are freed from the necessity of grabbing headlines in the same way. So I just want to note that having a corporate model for making the news has certain kinds of consequences that then drive how it is that journalists tell the news. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the story of Kitty Genovese. So there in the late 1980s, there are two famous Ivy League professors. Well, MIT is not exactly Ivy, but close to it, who created a book called Manufacturing Consent that took the discipline of media studies by storm and has been foundational in understanding the ways in which the news media operate ever since. And I'm going to tell you some of the details of their theory of news media and update them a little bit, since obviously the 1980s news media were operating somewhat differently than today in the era of the internet and the era of social media. But these two professors, just to give you background, since as we know, we always have to ask, who is it that is telling us the things that we are learning about? These two professors are Noam Chomsky, a very famous linguist from MIT, and Ed Herman, a professor in the Wharton School of Management at University of Pennsylvania. And both of them are considered, very much considered experts in their field. So these professors created what they call the propaganda model, which was an explanation as to how we can predict the ways in which the news media tend to operate. What are their motivations that then help us understand how the news gets shaped and how it gets told? And if you think about this model in relationship to the story of Kitty Genovese, it makes a lot of sense. So Chomsky and Herman, in their book Manufacturing Consent, wrote, and I will quote, "People buying the newspaper are the product which is sold to the businesses that buy advertising space. The news itself has only a marginal role as the product." So this is a really interesting way of thinking about the news, right? It's not that the news is the product that you then buy. That's not what it is. The news is instead a hook that grabs your eyeballs, and then your eyeballs are sold to advertisers. It's your eyeballs that are the product. The consumer are the advertisers who want your attention. They're consuming your attention. And you are merely the product that's being sold, and the bait is the news that's pulling you in. So it's not that the news media are inherently oriented towards trying to tell the truth. If they are operating within a profit model, instead, what they are doing is attempting to lure you in with something like a version of what they think you will be interested in, so that they can then sell your eyeballs to advertisers. In a similar book by Dr. John Hamilton called All the News That's Fit to Sell, which has a very similar understanding of how the news is generated and what motivates journalists, Hamilton writes, "News emerges not from individuals seeking to improve the functioning of democracy, but from readers seeking diversion, reporters forging careers, and owners searching for profits." So we've already established the profit motive for the owners who have these news media outlets. But it's also important to note that the news and the whole experience of the news is shaped by two other facets as well. It's not just owners wanting profits, it's also editors and journalists who want careers for themselves. So they may, to some extent, want you to have the truth about things. That might be part of their motivation, but also they want to be famous, or at least they want to have a profitable career that they can bank on. So that will then shape the way that they tell the news, because the way they tell the news will have to relate to whether owners of news corporations are willing to hire them or not. And also it will have to relate to what kinds of stories are likely to make a name for them. So remember, this is all then generating a kind of sensationalism in the news that then relates to what it is that viewers themselves are doing. We think about the news as being what's called the fourth estate. So if we have the executive branch of government, we have the judicial branch of government, and we have the legislative branch of government, the news media are considered another facet of all of that in government, because they're supposed to shine a light on what's happening in the other three branches of democracy. And without the fourth estate, we can't really know what's going on in these other branches. So it's key to democracy, which is true, but also note that when that is within the constraints of the profit motive, and also when it's in the constraints of a viewership or a readership that is more interested in entertainment than in real information, then sometimes what is fed to viewers and readers is more about diversion, entertainment, and excitement than it is about what's happening that they need to know for the true functioning of democracy. So these are all key things to think about as critical thinkers when we put the pieces together about what the news media does, why it does it, what motivates the way in which it happens. So Chomsky and Herman in Manufacturing Consent created a theory that they call the propaganda model, and their hypothesis is as follows. Mainstream media filters the news and narratives available to the general public in ways that favor the interests of the wealthy and powerful who themselves own and control those media. Perhaps this won't be that surprising to you, perhaps it will, but if you do a very careful analysis, objective analysis of the mainstream corporate news media or the closely allied nonprofit news sources where the journalists and editors may want to get jobs in the corporate news media so that they're still trying to operate within that framework, what you'll find is the stories that are told by that news media and the ways in which they're told tend to conform to the general interests of the wealthy and the powerful. And it will tend to range only insofar as the interests of the powerful and the wealthy themselves range. But that's still a fairly narrow scope in which to report or tell stories or tell the truth. There's a whole other massive range of reality out there that is not in fact being reported by mainstream media because it doesn't comport with the interests of the wealthy who own the news media itself. So the news media as a mouthpiece for the interests of the wealthy will then exclude points of view and experiences of those that would undermine the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. So again, you'll have a range of conversation, but it's a very narrow range, and all of it has to more or less fit within the interests of competing versions of the lives, the wills, the interests, the demands of the wealthy and powerful. So one of those filters that filters out the news and maintains that very narrow range of stories that get told and the ways of telling those stories is ownership. Who owns the news media itself? This is a fairly straightforward, easy to understand idea that if a wealthy person like Jeff Bezos owns a newspaper like the Washington Post, which he does. Jeff Bezos, the founder and owner of Amazon, owns also the Washington Post, a major newspaper in the United States. It's not at all surprising that the Washington Post would not be reporting on things that would make Jeff Bezos look bad or make him feel uncomfortable, right? It would filter out those kinds of stories. So the Washington Post under Bezos's ownership is not going to focus in on the way in which Amazon treats its employees or the ways in which Amazon is closely, or Jeff Bezos is closely associated with politicians in Washington, D.C. And during the presidential campaign of 2024, both the Washington Post and the LA Times were forced by the owners of those organizations to desist in putting forward a endorsement for a presidential candidate. It's very typical for newspapers to endorse political candidates across the nation. That's common. But in the 2024 presidential campaign, the owners of those news organizations forced the editors and journalists to not endorse. So who owns a paper can shape very directly what is told by that paper and how it is told. Ownership as one of the filters on how the news gets made. So one of the things to note about the ownership of our news media is that over the course of several decades, um, large corporations have continually bought up smaller news organizations so that there are now today overall very few ultimate owners of news media, other forms of media as well, but news media along with that. So that where it used to be very common that there were um, a huge number of owners of newspapers and radios and magazines and even television stations, now today there are fewer and fewer, such that really there's what are called the big six in the media, and they end up owning most of all the media, including the news media. So the ownership model that I was talking about as a filter on the news today means that very few people have control over what news stories get told and how they get told in the United States. So here is another slide that represents that tiny little group of news media owners. And you can see that, for example, News Corp, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, not only does it own TV stations, it also owns newspapers. It also owns cable television. So News Corp, Rupert Murdoch owns both Fox News and also the Wall Street Journal and also the New York Post and also Sky News, which is international. So that one person or one set of owners end up controlling tons of news outlets. And so ownership, again, gets concentrated in just a few hands in this way, which didn't used to be true. It used to be quite diverse so that you had the potential for more disagreement between owners themselves, which could then allow for a broader range of stories. But as things have gotten bought up and made into conglomerates over the years, that's less and less true. Okay, so we have ownership. Our next major filter on how the news gets made and told is advertising. Remember, we said that it's not that the news is the product that you're purchasing. That's a very small part of the profit. Rather, the news is a hook that pulls you in, and your eyeballs are the product that's being sold to advertisers. What this then means is that advertisers have a lot of control over how the news gets told. Because if the editors and journalists are attempting to please the advertisers by giving them what they want, then advertisers can pull their funding and in ways that then control how editors and journalists can tell their stories. So very often, advertisers will either threaten or completely withdraw their funds from a news organization, and that will then change the way that that news organization will tell its story. So advertising is a major force in how the news gets told. So after ownership and advertising, next up is sourcing. Sourcing is the idea that those who are wealthy and powerful, separate from the question of ownership and advertising, themselves have more control over how a story gets told. So, for example, Harvey Weinstein was known to be a sexual predator for a very long time, both by people in the film industry and by journalists. But his story never came out in public, in large part because he's a powerful player. And the news organizations did not want the consequences of going up against him initially. And that was not just because he was powerful, but also because he had at his on his payroll very powerful or very effective lawyers. And so the news media were knew that they would be up against a legal battle. but they were also afraid of the consequences for their own careers based on what Harvey Weinstein could do to them. So the source of the story itself helped control the fact that his story didn't get told for a very long time until it became in the better interests of the news media to tell it than not tell it. But for a very long time, he was able to keep his story under wraps. So sourcing, the very people who are powerful, particularly politicians and the very wealthy, they oftentimes have a lot of control over how stories get told by editors and journalists, because editors and journalists don't want to make them angry, don't want them to withdraw information and don't want them to withdraw access. So particularly politicians. So the sources themselves, if they're wealthy or if they're powerful, they often control how a story gets told by the news media. So we've got ownership, advertising, sourcing, and the next in the Chomsky and Herman model is what's called FLAC in their model, which is like pushback or anger. Today we can think of this as something like cancel culture, or it's also related to all of the metrics that are now gathered in relationship to how people watch and like, share, dislike, comment on something in social media. So this is cancel culture, this is metrics, but it's also those old-fashioned versions of letters to the editor or anger from the public expressed in phone calls to the editor, things like that. But today it's best thought of in terms of cancel culture. So that if you're an editor or journalist, and you're afraid that you could have your entire, you could be doxxed, you could have your entire career undermined by a public that is angry at the way you told a story, then you're going to tell your story in such a way that that's not going to happen to you. Or you're likely going to try and skirt around things in such a way that you're maybe not telling it as honestly as you would if that weren't your fear. So flack or cancel culture or the fear of doxing, that then will sometimes shape the way that the news media operate and the stories that get told. Okay, ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack / cancel culture / metrics. The last is fear-mongering, and this is related to the human tendency to be attracted by things that are scary, to have our focus on things that are dangerous for us. So this is negativity bias turned into a tool for the news media. So the news media are more likely to tell stories that will make us feel fearful because those stories are better at getting our attention and holding our attention, and therefore they make it easier to capture us and sell our eyeballs to advertisers. So fear is going to filter out stories that are less, or let me rephrase that. Our negativity bias is going to mean that that news editors filter out stories that are less fear-mongering. They like fear-mongering stories because they will pull us in, and then they will therefore filter out other kinds of stories and other ways of reporting things. So any ideologies that exploit our fear of outsiders, especially groups that they can then tell us pose a potential threat, or that they can exaggerate stories about, those are the stories that they're likely to both run and that they're likely to run continually, because those are the stories that pull us in, hold us, and capture our eyeballs for advertisers. Okay, so to give you an example of this last, and really actually all of these various filters together, I want you to think back to what you learned about the Iraq War in high school, or maybe you've had something on this here at Cal State Long Beach as well. So write this down for yourself before I move on to the next slide. What's the answer to this question? Why was it that the United States invaded Iraq in 2003? Ask yourself that and try and remember, what was the explanation? Why did we invade Iraq in 2003? So while you write that down, I'm just going to show you some images from the Iraq War of people fleeing Baghdad and some vets there fighting fighter jets, and then the mass bombing of the cities in Iraq. Why did we do this? Why did we go into this country? You may have written down something like ISIS. We went into Iraq to eradicate ISIS. I've had a lot of students say that over the years, but ISIS in fact did not exist at all in 2003. And as I'll explain in a minute, it was a consequence of, in fact, the invasion of Iraq rather than preceding the invasion in Iraq. So not that. Maybe you wrote down something like 9/11, that this was somehow part of our response to 9/11. It's true that it happened after 9/11, but there were no Iraqis at all involved in 9/11, not one. And Saddam Hussein, who was at that time the head of Iraq, had nothing to do with the planning or the funding of 9/11. So it was absolutely not related to 9/11 directly. So then why? What was it that we were doing invading Iraq? I'm going to go into some of the details on what this war cost us. So the Bush administration that took us into the war in Iraq, they claimed that they had intelligence that said that Saddam Hussein had what Bush was calling weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. And they claimed that this somehow posed a threat to the United States. It turned out that that was entirely untrue. Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction. And even if he did have, it wasn't at all clear that he had any intent to use anything related to the United States. So this was, in fact, untrue. It was a lie. The Bush administration did not have intelligence that indicated this, and yet they convinced the American people to support them in invading a country that had not provoked them in any way, with the story that they were somehow a danger to us, despite the fact that they were not. So a year after we had invaded Iraq, the United States Senate officially released a report which showed that, in fact, there was no intelligence indicating that there was any danger to the United States, or that there were any weapons of mass destruction at all. And yet, in that intervening time between when the Bush administration told the American people this and when the United States Senate said, no, there's no weapons of mass destruction, in that intervening time, the United States not only invaded but killed 300,000 Iraqis. Some estimates put that number as high as 3 million. So there's a massive range, but American government numbers themselves, so our own government, admits to having killed 300,000 people when they invaded Iraq. Put this in the context of the recent death tolls in Gaza, which are horrifying but don't reach anywhere near the numbers of 300,000 dead. And over 1.1 million Iraqis were displaced. And the cost to American taxpayers in terms of dollars was over $3 trillion. $3 trillion. So massive toll, both in terms of cost, in terms of lives, and in terms also of the vets who served in the Iraq War. So the Financial Times estimated that we had spent, of the $3 trillion that we spent, that 138 billion of that went to private corporate security, logistics, and reconstruction contractors after we devastated everything. We paid companies like Halliburton and Bechtel to go in and rebuild a bit. So a lot of the profits went to these kinds of corporations. And we spent a huge amount of money on the toll to our own American troops. So PTSD or the health problems resulting from breathing in chemicals from burn pits, which was a major problem in Iraq, and the loss of limbs, the loss of other abilities. So this is a huge toll on the American military as well. And Iraq War veterans continue to deal with the fallout along with their families in their lives. I know quite a few Iraq vets who are still dealing with the consequences of having been sent to this war, despite the fact that, as far as we can tell, there was no good reason for us to invade. And Iraq itself remains absolutely devastated. They have never been able to regain the political stability or the economic stability that they had prior to our invasion. 20 years on now, the country remains devastated. And that devastation then laid the groundwork for the rise of ISIS, which you may have heard about as this terrorist organization that started to control parts of Syria and Iraq in the aftermath or in the wake of the Iraq War and the Syrian Civil War. So we then went back in to fight ISIS, but ISIS was only able to get a foothold in the first place because we had so devastated Iraq, and people were both looking for some leadership and also angry enough to be able to join a terrorist organization like ISIS. So just laying out some of the various consequences for this decision to invade a country that had no weapons of mass destruction and no intent to use them had they, if they had gotten them. So how did we get convinced to do this? Well, this is a story of the news media. The news media were extremely involved in convincing the American people that, in fact, weapons of mass destruction did exist in Iraq and that the Bush administration was justified in prompting us to invade that country. The news media were the allies of the government in spreading this set of lies, this disinformation that then created this havoc both on Iraq, the region as a whole, and in the lives of the veterans who served in that war. So note here in this graph that I have that in the run-up to the war in Iraq, when people were, when the government was testing the waters on whether or not the public would support such an invasion, note that 71% of American news sources wrote their stories in favor of invading a country that there was no reason to invade. 71%. And only 3% were anti-war. And a larger number than anti were neutral, but still those who were neutral were a far smaller element than those who were pro-war. And this was true in not just the United States, but in other English-speaking news outlets in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, other places that were publishing in English. So the blue shows outside news sources in English. But both of them, and particularly those in the United States, were very happy to support the idea of us going to war. If you think back to the question of negativity bias and fear-mongering, you'll understand that war grabs our eyeballs and it sells to advertisers because it will hold us in a way that no other story will. War is the very best content for the news media to circulate within a corporate construction of the news media. So within a corporate model where corporations are attempting to gain profits through news, there's nothing better to do that than the fear associated with a story that we are in danger and need to attack. So there was no good journalistic reason for organizations like the New York Times, which led the way, just like with the story of Kitty Genovese, led the way with misleading the American people. There was no good reason for them to do that journalistically. There's only good business sense for them to tell a story like that. So, and related to a larger cultural moment in which there was such high Islamophobia that it was easy to sell a story about danger emanating out of the Middle East to the American public, even if there was no basis for the stories that that organizations like the New York Times were circulating. And I really do say the New York Times here because New York Times was at the forefront of championing the invasion of a country that had no good reason to be invaded. So that's why I bring this story up, so that you have a sense of why the news media matter so much, why we need to think so critically about them. This is not just a story of like, oh, fake news. This is the basis upon which decisions like invading a country, devastating a country, killing hundreds of thousands of people, spending trillions of dollars, and harming the lives of veterans and their families gets made. These kinds of decisions get made through the news media, who then convince us of what we think we know. Back to epistemology. How do we know what we think we know? So as critical thinkers, you absolutely have to start pushing back against the news media and thinking about them critically in ways that will allow you to then know that you know what you know and not just think that you know what you know. So just to note that this did not end with the Iraq War, right? It didn't begin with the Iraq War either. The Spanish-American War was also very much a story of news media pushing us to go to war. The Mexican-American War was very much a story of us going to war for the sake of newspapers, as was Iraq in lots of ways. Or rather, it's not that that's why we went to war, but that is how we got convinced to go to war, because there were other interests at stake there as well. But what about now? Are the news media doing a better job today of reporting just the facts, or is there also a lot of bias in the way that they report the stories? So with, for example, the war on Gaza, I'll note that The Intercept did an analysis of the amount of coverage of the deaths of Palestinians in relationship to the amount of time that went on over the war. So as Palestinian deaths started to mount, coverage of those stories started to decline. So initially, when Gaza started to be bombed and invaded, the coverage of those stories was pretty high. But as time went on and the number of deaths just skyrocketed, then the coverage of those stories went the other direction. So we didn't have a mirroring of what was going on. In fact, we had an inverse relationship where the more the deaths, the less coverage in major news sources. And then comparing the coverage of the LA Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, three major newspapers in the United States, the Intercept found in March 2024 that those three news organizations used words like slaughter, massacre, and horrific to describe Israeli deaths, but rarely to describe Palestinian deaths. So Palestinian deaths were treated differently than Israeli deaths. So again, just to note that the news media and its relationship to how we think about wars and what's going on around us with wars continues to be non-objective, right? This is not a mirroring of the world, but instead a sculpting of what we perceive to be the world. So it becomes a filter on what we know about the world. So then what do we do? Because obviously we need the news media. We need to know what's going on in the world. We need that form of epistemology, right? We need science. We also need news media because it's key that we know something beyond our own lives and that we shine a spotlight on what our governments are doing and how our taxpayer dollars are being spent. All of that's quite important. So then how do we as critical thinkers relate to the news media? We need to ask ourselves, first of all, whether we're getting news media at all, like good quality news media at all. So stop and ask yourself, think about it for a second. Do I even get the news? Like, if you're in social media and that's where you spend all of your time, you likely aren't getting much in the way of news unless you have specifically shaped your feed and your algorithms to give you a bunch of news. But even then, you're still getting the algorithmic version of news, right? What your social media algorithms want you to see. I would recommend that you go outside social media and that you access news media that are known to be more accurate than others. Not to say that they are always accurate, but that are known to be more accurate than others. And that you do that in ways that then continue to inform you over the course of your life about what's going on in the world. And if you are, you have qualms about disrupting your mental health, as we've talked about earlier in the semester, with a constant flow of negative stories coming through the news media, you have a really valid reason to want to be careful about how you access news about what's going on in the world. I would recommend that all of us not follow the headlines, but instead, or like the breaking news, or watch TV news, but instead that we go to long forms of news in the form of podcasts or in the form of long journalistic pieces, not quick headliney sorts of things, that then help us analyze what has taken place rather than keeping up on the latest, instead looking retrospectively at what's happened over the course of a week or the course of a month. And there are many good analytic podcasts in particular that can help you stay informed without keeping you on the edge of your seat in relationship to bad breaking news, but it can instead be a form of calm analysis instead. So where do you find these sources and how do you know that they are trustworthy? There is a nonprofit, third-party, outside organization called Ad Fontes that puts together what they call the media bias chart that can give you some access to a somewhat objective analysis of the news media themselves. So an analysis of those who are supposed to be doing an analysis. And as you'll notice, looking at this slide, right up at the top, there is less range in political opinion. So the farther down you go in terms of things being about analysis, you get further and further away. But for the organizations that are claiming to just report the news itself, and that are considered to be more factual in news reporting, they tend to get closer to some sort of center politically. This is related to what I was saying earlier, that corporate news media in the center tend to have a narrow range of political opinion. It's true, but also objectively speaking, these organizations that are at the top have been considered more factual. Whether or not their politics ranges widely or not, which it doesn't, which is what Herman and Chomsky point out, they tend to be more factual. So these are organizations that you can at least go to for and know that you're not getting fake news by and large. Of course, there are exceptions like the Iraq War. And it's not to say that you're not getting any bias at all, just as I showed you with the last slide a few slides ago. You will get bias, but these are news sources that are less biased than other news sources. So we're talking here about National Public Radio, the Public Broadcasting System, the BBC, Al Jazeera, the Wall Street Journal, the Vox is up there on top. So some of these that are there are actually more research organizations than they are news organizations, and they often are very factual, but they're not about news as much. So that would be like the Pew Research Center. But double check whether or not your news sources, if you have any at all, are considered to be more factual or not. So get closer to the top if you can of this news chart and stay away from the things that are near the bottom, since they are considered to be, by and large, inaccurate, not factual. Okay, so Kitty Genovese and her death were misrepresented by the New York Times for a couple of reasons. First, for the career of the journalists and the editors involved, and then second, for the corporate profit of the New York Times and its owners more generally. And this is true also in news that we are consuming today, and news that then took us into the war in Iraq, or news that gets filtered to us about ongoing wars. We need to be skeptical, and we need to reach outside any one particular source to try and get a variety of views to try and offset the biases that are inherent in much of the news reporting in the mainstream media. So just like the science that we read, we need to vet it, compare it with other sources, see whether or not it's been replicated. Similarly with the news, we need to not rely on just one source. We need to make sure that our sources have been considered by outside nonprofit observers to be higher quality, even if they're not perfect. And we need to actually spend time to get in-depth analyses as opposed to following just the headlines that we may not be able to make sense of and that may not, in fact, have benefited from calm, thoughtful analysis. So the news media need to be thought about critically, just like science. And you as a critical thinker should always be asking yourself, what do I not know about this? What do other people say about this? What are other sources on this? And push back against trusting the news media at face value. Yeah.